Hello, my name's Tim Dixon and I'm co-author with Mark Tewdwr-Jones of our new book on urban futures. Firstly, I'd like to thank Mark for his input into the book and also to all the team at Bristol University Press and the Policy Press for making the publication possible. In this short film today, we'd like to highlight the main features of the book and why we think it's so vital, now more than ever, to think about the long-term urban future to 2040 and beyond. There's no doubt that we live in a heavily urbanized world, with more than 70% of us expected to live in cities globally by 2050. Cities also consume a lot of energy and produce the majority of the world's carbon emissions. And this is part of the so-called urban paradox we face in terms of the trade-off between continued economic growth and environmental and socio-economic impact in our cities. Perhaps it isn't surprising now that many people argue we're living in a new Anthropocene or urban age, where humankind's influence on climate change and the environment is so all-encompassing. This means that decision makers in cities and planners in particular, as Mark will explain later, have some really critical issues to address. Often we've seen planning in cities suffering from short-termism as political cycles, the comfort of thinking only about what we think we know, and other pressures constrain our ability to think longer term and tackle the really important issues of climate change and resource depletion. So there's therefore often a disconnection between short-term planning horizons in cities and longer-term environmental changes. We need to think longer term, therefore, and develop better tools to overcome this disconnection. And we firmly believe that the pandemic has in fact accelerated the need for change. So this means we must look beyond the next 5 years and instead to 2040 and beyond as we seek to come out of the COVID crisis. But it also means understanding the past and present of a place to understand its future. For example, here in Reading, understanding the history of Reading from Saxon times and the might of the abbey in the 12th century to the more recent past as a place of 3 Bs, that's beer, biscuits and bulbs, to more recent times to the technology, the life sciences and knowledge economy of today. In the book, therefore, we develop the concept of what we call urban futures. Now, this term means imagining what cities and urban areas will be like in the long term, beyond 20 years, how they'll operate, what infrastructure and governance systems will underpin and coordinate them, and how they're best shaped and influenced by their primary stakeholders. That's civil society, government, businesses and investors, and academia. And at the heart of urban futures thinking is the concept of city foresight. And this is kind of the science of thinking about the future of cities, and includes a range of different futures-based methods and tools which can help develop a city vision. For example, backcasting, which starts with defining a desirable future and then works backwards to identify how to get there. Urban futures thinking requires city stakeholders to work together to co-create and co-produce a city vision in a really participatory way. This means that the 4 main groups I referred to earlier need to work collaboratively to build and develop city visions. And we often refer to this as the quadruple helix in a kind of innovation context. And as part of urban futures thinking, city visioning is a formal process of creating a city vision or a shared and desirable trajectory for a particular city or urban area. There are 3 key points from the book that I'd like to highlight. Firstly, we do need to recognise that cities are complex and suffer from inherently interconnected, wicked problems which may be difficult to resolve. For example, energy, climate change and environmental justice issues which are complex, interrelated and operate at an urban scale. Secondly, and very importantly, we don't subscribe to the view that we can't shape the future and solve the problems we can identify, simply because, as some would argue, we are part of that future and so cannot influence it. Using city foresight techniques, as we did with the Reading 2050 and Newcastle City Futures project, does, we believe, enable us to develop alternative and desirable futures, which could be both smart and sustainable if we develop a roadmap and a strategy to achieve them. And it's really important to stress that these are not predictions as such, but rather shared and co-created visions and roadmaps to produce a desirable future or set of futures for a city. Thirdly, we strongly believe that city visions must be co-created or co-produced to help develop inclusive and just transitions for our cities. This means working across interest groups, professional and disciplinary boundaries, and even geographic boundaries to develop a clear sense of the future that everyone in the city can buy into, but will also enable the vision to have a realistic chance of success because of the way it's created and produced and hopefully ultimately achieved. Certainly, despite the current pandemic, the city isn't dead, as we highlight in the book. Cities have always been able to bounce back and reinvent themselves, as we've seen through history. But the threat of climate change is still with us, now more than ever before. And if global temperatures of 1.5 degrees C are to be avoided, then cities must be net zero by at least 2050. That's why we've seen so many cities across the world declaring climate emergencies and developing strategies to help achieve net zero. But we haven't always seen the same level of ambition around city visioning. So we believe now really is the time that we need to act if we're to develop longer-term city visions. Before I hand over to Mark, I'd like to end with a quote from Greta Thunberg, who we feature in our book. She wrote, "There are no grey areas when it comes to survival. Now we all have a choice. We can create transformational action that will safeguard the living conditions for future generations, or we can continue with our business as usual and fail. And that is up to you and me." So I really hope you enjoy reading the book. And now I'll hand over to Mark, who will give his perspective on what this means for urban planning.
Now, it's our belief that there is a role for planning in trying to counter some of the biggest challenges that we are seeing in cities. There's a need for long-term thinking. There's a need to be visionary and bold if we're going to really address some of those problems and carve out a pathway for cities to improve people's livelihoods and urban spaces. And COVID has shown to all of us about the need to address some of these difficulties in a much more strident way, urgently, than perhaps has been the case up until now. That's about sustainability, it's about the future of our shopping areas, it's about having inclusive and affordable housing. It's taking into account the sort of smart city that we're living in and access to technology, or whether excluded from access to technology, and issues to do with mobility and transport use in the city and the rights between car users and pedestrians and cyclists and so on, having access to green space, which is very important for health and well-being purposes as well. These are fundamental problems that we're seeing that are affecting cities and people in cities today, but we know that if we don't address some of those challenges, they're going to create even greater problems for future generations. So the idea of planning addressing some of these issues, I think, is there. The case is there. The question is, what sort of planning do we use to address those issues? Do we use what we've been used to through development plans and master plan techniques, or do we rethink planning and say maybe they were 20th century tools and now we need a type of planning that is much more relevant for the 21st century? That means essentially moving away from static blueprint top-down plans for cities led by a few experts and professionals in the mayor's office. We need to see cities for what they are. They're an amalgam of all sorts of peoples and communities and businesses and a range of service providers. And it is quite right that we should consider ways that bring all those disparate groups together to create a shared vision for the future. There might be experts that enable it to happen and who draft a vision, but it has to be informed by everyone who lives and works in the city because it affects their future. So a type of planning that's multiple, that addresses visions and responds to different needs of different groups in a city, that addresses issues of power as well as the powerless, that deals with sustainability and growth and inclusivity in a combined way, not seeing these as trade-offs between one issue or another, or in one part of the city or another, but a way of recognizing that there's systemic and synoptic role to play here for planning, to look at the relationships caused by these things coming together in different parts of an urban area. So what sort of planning are we talking about? Well, it's one that really is about utilizing the city's assets. Every city has some good things about it. It might be struggling, people in it might be struggling as well, but every city has good points, and you need to start with those good points and build up your long-term vision, which will make a difference, and a meaningful and visible difference to that city itself. Because let's face it, we get to the stage where cities are almost identical. You can find the same shops, the same sort of businesses, maybe even the same sorts of transport the world over. Surely we go to cities and we enjoy visiting cities when we can because of distinctiveness. That might be historic, it might be cultural, it might be creative, a whole host of reasons, architectural, of course, as well. So we need to recognize what are the distinctive assets of an individual city and use those as the basis of saying that our vision for a long-term plan for this place is based on the recognition of distinctiveness and difference here. That's the first issue to recognize, which challenges the existing planning system in many countries as well. The second thing is you need to harness all this data and intelligence you can muster to recognize how that city is being reshaped every single day. Old style planning was very much about going away, collecting data, producing a vision for a 10-year period, and then trying to implement it. Well, now we produce data by the nanosecond. We can pick up, even on our own mobile devices, data about air quality, about transport usage, about pedestrian footfall, about retailing, about house prices, you name it. That data is now more accessible to more people than ever before. And also we can track what happens in the city on a much more short-term basis. So an idea of a fixed plan only revisited every 10 years is perhaps an old way of doing it. So surely we could now look at a way of harnessing all this data that's already there, available to us, and think about a cycle, a program of initiatives and policies that respond to change as we are witnessing it. That means having a destination that we know we want to get to. We want to be more sustainable, more inclusive, better connected, have more affordable services and properties in the city. But we need to embark on a series of initiatives rather than a single policy, shall we say, or strategy in order to achieve it. There are plenty of places around the world that have started to do this, from the likes of Bristol and Reading and Newcastle in the UK and Milton Keynes, through to Sydney and Nairobi and Johannesburg and Helsinki and Atlanta. There are plenty of examples of where those cities are starting to come together between communities, governments, businesses, and maybe even the university sector to start to work creatively together and collaboratively to harness the data, recognize the assets, and think long-term. And this is an important point. It is a long-term game here. For so long we have seen in planning, it's about short-term vested interests, predominantly of the property market. Well, that has to change. It now has to be a planning of multiple sources and of multiple agencies working together, and recognizing that although there might be short-term gains for certain sectors, it's about keeping an eye on the long-term prize and working towards that long-term prize as well. The methods that we use to do that in planning also have to change. We need to develop much more visual techniques, visible techniques, meaningful techniques that everyone in the city can understand and be part of. And so the sorts of tools that we've used in planning, now old style blueprint documents, have got to change. This is all quite different to perhaps how we've managed and planned cities up until now. But then we've never had to face the sort of amazing, wicked challenges that are likely to address and be faced in urban areas as we proceed through the 21st century. So recognizing 21st century challenge means recognizing the need to plan better and more inclusively, but with a multiplicity of tools that are much more collaborative in nature. That is the challenge facing all of us. It can be done and has been done in many good cities around the world. Why aren't we seeing this as something that's more standard and normal for cities to embark on rather than the exceptions to the rule?